Hey, everybody, welcome back. Another episode of Dynasty Leverage brought to you by Dynasty Pandemic. Check out the app, Dynasty Pandemic, and then also check out our show that we do, Dynasty Trades in 5, at Trades in 5 on Twitter. And I got into it today, and it really hasn't just been today, it's been the last week or so since the playoff games ended. So let's call it maybe the last 5 or 6 days. We've seen the debate about CDLAM, and it's not just CDLAM. But it just stems a much larger argument, especially at this time during the dynasty season. The 2021 season just ended. So we have this dead period, and it's not really a dead period. It's just a period where people start to really readjust and calibrate their values. And we're now at a point where everybody basically in Dynasty is up in the air in terms of what their value is compared to what it was just 2 months ago. And I think the large conclusion, and it isn't really something that's talked about on a large scale, but it's summed up by a friend of mine, Curtis Patrick, who put this tweet out and basically just said in response to a back and forth we were having about CD Lamb is, there's basically like half a dozen players in Dynasty, and we're excluding quarterbacks here. I think when you're talking super flex, and especially when you're getting into some scarce formats, quarterbacks can be thrown into the play, especially, in super flex formats where they go, 7 or 8 quarterbacks will go in the top 9, 10 picks. So you're going to see that a lot. And then we're just talking about like a start one tight end league as well, where people are not going to necessarily reach on tight ends because of the scarcity of the format. But let's just assume it's even super flex. You probably have maybe like a dozen to 18 players that people actually want. They covet. They'll go out and pay for regardless of the price. And that follows up one of the tweets that I put out the other day was a lot of players, essentially their market is just, are those types of players available? So let's just call it maybe 15 to 20 players, right, in Dynasty, to where everybody in your league wants them, period. Everyone in your league wants them. There is no, I think he's overvalued. I think he's overrated. I don't really want him. I really wouldn't pay. Everybody would probably be interested in paying and paying up and paying close to what the market price is if you come to agreement on what the market price actually is. But after that, that's where we start to get into a lot of these nuanced debates. And that leads me to this CD Lamb argument, because really with CD Lamb, the writing was on the wall. We did a Dynasty Trades in 5 on CD Lamb. And I've been saying this for a couple months. CD Lamb is not an elite receiver. Look at his usage. Look at his market share. We did a video on Amari Cooper a couple weeks back and talked about CD Lamb on that video. And it basically said his numbers through 2 years are not elite. That doesn't mean he's not good. That doesn't mean he's not a coveted dynasty asset. That doesn't mean he can't get better. But the odds he jumps into the range of, oh my gosh, he's blowing the league apart. I have to have him. I can trade him for anything I can get. I'm going to be able to name the price. Most players don't get there. He's probably not going to get there. There's enough that you have from a sample size perspective. He's not going to get there. A lot of guys that end up getting there, they show it right away. And that's where this idea of, well, we give up on players too quickly in Dynasty. If they don't hit within 6 games, they suck. That's not at all what that means. But I think the reason and the justification behind this, and I'm guilty of this narrative, I'm guilty of talking about this with receivers especially. And you'll hear people push back and go, well, it's not fair to judge a receiver when they don't do anything in year one. That's not necessarily true, because at best, a lot of guys that do nothing in year one, all that really means, it doesn't mean they can't be a good player. It just means there's a very high likelihood that their ceiling ever reaches this like 15 to 20 players that we're talking about. And that's essentially what we're talking about with CD Lamb. Is no one's saying he sucks. No one is saying that he's not a good receiver, he's a bust. No, I think most people would want him on their team. But I think it's fair to say, with what we've seen in the last 2 years, that he is not going to reach that level. He may have a season where he can reach close to that level, but consistently, is he going to hold it for the next 2, 3, 4 years where it's worth paying the wide receiver 3 price? Again, I think if you look at the receiver landscape right now, it's Jefferson and Chase and Jefferson. Then there's a massive drop-off. And you can name whoever the hell you want at wide receiver 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it doesn't matter. The drop-off is so significant right now, and this could change. This could change. Someone else could jump up. A rookie could come in and be here in the next year. Who knows? But right now, it is such a drop off. The argument was never CD Lamb's not any good. But CD Lamb had like this fictitious ceiling that people just assumed that give it like 4 years and he's going to be in that category. And the pushback has been, well, one, his target share and his market share doesn't warrant that he's ever going to get there. Two, if he was good enough to get there, he would have gotten there regardless of his circumstances. There wouldn't be these slight bumps in his profile where you're going, oh, well, they're throwing to Dalton Schultz. Okay, if he's the best receiver in the league, Dalton Schultz doesn't matter. If he's the best receiver in the league, then it doesn't matter whether Michael Gallup plays or not. I think that's the nuance argument that we're talking about here. So it brings me to this whole point about the leverage. I'm almost 6 minutes in and we're talking, wide receivers, CeeDee Lamb. That wasn't the intent of this video. The intent is to talk about the leverage. So let's take that 15 to 20 player list, okay? Let's exclude them from this conversation, right? Those are players that if you have them, at least this is me, right? This is a guy that plays in 60 plus leagues, and I'm doing this on a large scale. So I'm probably more appealing to people that are playing in a lot of leagues that can actually look at this from a large scale perspective and say, okay, I can remove myself a little bit from the player itself. Okay, I don't really have to care when I'm in 60 leagues. I don't have to care about the players as much because I probably have exposure to all players, all offenses, different mixes, different combos. So I'm not really as worried about in one league I have this player. I'm not as worried about, okay, this player versus that player. What has a better situation? The points are going to kind of even themselves out. At least that's how I look at it when I'm in a ton of leagues. But across all those leagues, if I have one of those like 10 to 20 players in the elite range, I really don't want to move them. Now, sure, if I have too many shares of like Lamar Jackson, okay, and someone comes to me and says, I'll give you Kyler Murray and a 2023 second or something like that. Like I may pivot within a tier, but a lot of times those are strategic. And a lot of times that deal may get done and people may look at it and say, well, you traded Lamar Jackson. Does that mean you don't think he's any good? No, he's still in that tier. But the player I got back is also still in that like 15 to 20 tier. So I just look at it as essentially I'm pivoting across my portfolio. A lot of times those moves are meant more specifically on the design of my roster and the number of shares I might have of that player. Has very little to do with Lamar Jackson versus Kyler Murray because I look at it and say, you know what? I probably have X amount of exposure to both. And if it balances it out, then I'm okay with that. I have my own principles where I look at, how many different types of builds do I want to have and how much exposure to certain players, certain teams, certain stacks. All of that stuff, that can be a different show. But for purposes of this, yeah, I'll pivot within those tiers, but that says nothing about my evaluation on Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray. Relatively, they're the same. So a lot of times my motivation to sell one or the other is going to be a lot more based on what my portfolio looks like versus me trying to actually evaluate the difference between those two guys. Now, outside of those 20, and just back to those 20 real quick, when I have those guys, I do not sell them for downgrades outside of that 15 to 20 tier, unless I'm getting the extreme leverage. And I'll maybe give you an example of that. Let's say you have somebody that's in this range. Somebody maybe, let's say Jonathan Taylor. He's definitely in that range. I've done a running back show on this channel before and talked about Jonathan Taylor. It doesn't mean I don't want to sell Jonathan Taylor, but I look at this and I go, okay, he's a running back. He's a running back that seems extremely insulated right now, but we also know he's going into his third year. His value is never going to get high enough. That doesn't mean I just want to give him away. But if I'm getting an extreme leverage deal on somebody like Jonathan Taylor, right? Let's say I'm trading Jonathan Taylor and I'm getting back like Javonte Williams in at least a 2023 first, something like that. I'm like, okay, the idea here isn't that I'm trading Jonathan Taylor. It's that I'm getting the type of leverage that I want to get back. And now I've just shifted that move from having Jonathan Taylor on my roster to making a bet of, okay, maybe Taylor falls down a little bit over the next year or two, and maybe Javonte steps up. They never have to get even, right? But if it's within like 10%, then I probably won that deal comfortably because I stashed the extra 2023 first. So those are the only type of deals I'm looking, and they have to be extreme leverage. And you could maybe argue that the price on the open market is even more than that. And that's where I think you get into trouble with trading these guys away. Yes, certainly I'll trade those guys in the top 15 or 20, but it has to be a very specific targeted deal, and I have to get the leverage. It's essentially like giving up a dollar bill for like $1.60 and change. Essentially, I'm getting two assets back that are worth 80 cents. And the only thing I'm doing is now making a bet that my two 80-cent assets can get close to $1. And the dollar asset really can't go up anymore. That's really the leverage type of deal you're looking when you're trading one of those top 15 to 20 players, period. So it's almost always going to look like a 2-for-1, a 3-for-1, a massive package to where you have a lot more outs. And if you do that on a large scale, I bet you if I went through all of my 60 teams and I took all those players that I valued inside the top 20 or so, and I liquidated all of those players for these massive packages where I'm getting extreme leverage, picks, player downgrades that I think good bets on certain profiles, you'd probably have a lot of assets to play with going forward. Now, at some point, you're going to have to, reinvest those in players. But I think the 2023 class, and it's too late to do it at this point. If you're chasing 2023 first, you're not getting nearly the leverage you got 6 months ago or 12 months ago. So that's one of the other mistakes. And that leads into my next point. So excluding these 15 to 20 players, right? Now you get into like everybody else in Dynasty. And there's a certain cutoff. You can go to like DLF's ADP and you can look at where the receivers are that they kind of just die out. Then it's just a bunch of guys. Same thing with running backs. Running backs is a little bit different. Maybe I'll do a separate episode on running backs. And I kind of talked about this previously on another running back show, but running backs are so volatile in the offseason because it's like we have the insulated guys where you kind of know what their roles or their job's going to be next year. And that's maybe like 20 players. After that, you have a lot of good profiles. You have guys that have produced when they've had the opportunity, but you're not quite sure they're going to get the opportunity, or you're not quite sure what their situation is going to look like. Think of somebody like Sony Michel, right? Like he probably should be a top 40 dynasty running back, but that could easily jump up into the top 30 if he signs somewhere great, or it could drop outside of the top 60 if he goes somewhere else, low dollar deal, and it's a crowded depth chart. Like you could easily see the variance with a guy like Sony Michel, but I think we can all agree he belongs in that like second tier of guys I want on my roster, but there's going to be some sort of inflection point with his value at some point where he signs, how much he signs for, what the backfield looks like. But that's a player that I want. I want that type of player on my roster. However, I don't want to go and buy that player from somebody else because they're probably going to charge me. Well, yeah, maybe he signs somewhere as the lead back. I don't want to pay that price. So this gets into the next idea of outside of these top 20 players or so, and receivers very similar. Receiver and running backs are very similar, but for different reasons. Obviously, it's the running back volatility with, backups, guys on depth charts, all that stuff gets basically thrown into a big pile, shuffled up. And then once we get to the season, it's like, okay, now we have some clarity on what all the backfields in the NFL are going to look like. Here's who we think is going to get opportunity. Here's who may not have opportunity. Here are the players that are talented but don't have any opportunity right now. Here's the players that have a lot of opportunity but aren't that good. I mean, this is big cluster of running backs to where you have to kind of just let time even it out. With receivers, it's a little different. Right now, it's a very, very heavy receiver market. Everybody in startups, everybody in Dynasty is chasing receivers. Now, are they really chasing receivers, or are they chasing two things that I think are mistakes? One, everyone's chasing, I think, receivers because we've seen how much value explosion we got with like Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. So sure, everyone's probably chasing a lot of wide receiver 2s and a lot of wide receiver 3s because they see Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. And that's flawed. The same thing I talked about with CDLAM. Those guys probably are never going to get anywhere close. So even thinking about them in the same position is a flawed narrative if you're trying to think that way. Two, I think people are very scared of running backs right now. And so we've seen the last 2 years, if you just faded running back the last 2 years, literally, if you just took like a hero RB approach and you just bet on one running back per league, if this guy stays healthy, I'm going to build my roster around all the other positions and I have one running back. I have one shot. If he stays healthy, this team's going to be a juggernaut. If not, I'm right in the mix with most of the other teams in my league where all of their running backs are hurt. So sure, maybe that one guy I picked was Saquon Barkley, and for the last 2 years you've suffered, but have you really suffered that much? I mean, yeah, he's been hurt. Yeah, he's played, not a lot of games for you, and even more games he hasn't been himself. But at the same time, have you really lost that much against other teams in your league? Certainly, the team that had Jonathan Taylor this year, or the teams that had some of the elite running backs over the last 2 years, yeah, they've probably beat you. But it's not every team in the league. It's not like every single team in the league is smashing you at running back because all you had was Saquon Barkley and he's down. You've been able to replace running backs pretty easily over the last 2 years. So that has created this narrative across Dynasty where everyone's scared of running backs. Everyone is scared that their running back is going to be the next Ezekiel Elliott, who happens to be one of the guys that we probably undervalue because he's been on the field. But everyone's worried about investing in a veteran running back because they've seen the dead market for those guys. And so when you factor that in, now it's like, you have everyone chasing just receivers. Everyone is chasing these wide receiver heavy builds, which was the case like 5 years ago in Dynasty. And it's just come full circle back to where it is. And it's also impacted by the fact that 2023 is looked at like 2017 and 2020. It is going to be a class where we're going to replenish the ADP with high-end running backs. Now, whether they end up panning out, who knows? But the talent is there to do it. And it's also going to come at a perfect time. It is going to come at a time where our entire dynasty landscape at the running back position, aside from Taylor Swift, Najee Harris, Javonte Williams, maybe a couple of the rookies from this year, and a few other guys, maybe Cam Akers, maybe some of the other guys from 2020. You're going to have an ADP of like the top 24 running backs. Half of them people are going to be ready to push out. We already are. We're already looking at guys like Chubb, Kamara, Cook, McCaffrey, Mixon, Barkley, Eckler, Aaron Jones, Derrick Henry, Ezekiel Elliott. We're already looking at those guys waiting for the floor to drop out. And so, yeah, those players are tough to value because a lot of times, depending on my roster, I don't even want them. It might be a good deal for me to buy Dalvin Cook for a 2023 first. But if I already have a team that has Joe Mixon and a team that has, say, Antonio Gibson, I have no interest in using my picks in that fashion, even if it's a good deal. So for me to say, okay, I'm not going to trade a 2023 first for Dalvin Cook, most people would say, well, that's crazy. But no, I look at it and I go, it's diminishing returns for me on this roster to make that move. That's another reason why people are chasing receivers so heavy, because they go, you know what? If I just trade down and get an extra 2023 first, I'm going to build a strong team. I'm going to go 0 RB and kind of just say, screw it for next year. Then I'll add a couple running backs in the draft. And I think everyone's doing that now. So it comes back to my point where it's like, after the elite 15 to 20 players, you essentially just have every other relevant receiver, every other relevant running back. And I'll exclude tight ends just because in a 1.5 premium, they don't move the needle. Basically, you never want to flex a tight end. So it's essentially, it lines up with the top 7 or 8 tight ends are flex worthy in 1.5 premium, start one. And those guys are the ones that are probably going to be close to valued inside like that top 20 players, right? There might be a few tight ends in there. There might not, but they're almost on an island. So I'm just looking at running backs and receivers. Outside of the top 20 or so, you can throw running backs, every other running back, receivers, every other receiver, and quarterbacks. Every other like top 10, top 12 quarterback. You just throw them in a big mix. You're probably talking about 200 plus players almost. You just throw them like in a big mixing bowl. And almost the leverage with that big mixing bowl group of players is, who do I want and who do I want to sell? Period. And if you ever find yourself with one of those players in this huge mix, and this includes guys like CDLAM and AJ Brown and DK Metcalf and Matthew Stafford and Kirk, a lot of good players in this mix, right? But at the same time, I look at that mix and I go, there's just not a lot of pure demand for those players. And so I really just put them in a group of like, does the market want to buy this player? Does the market want to sell this player? Because I look at those players, say somebody like Kirk Cousins versus Matthew Stafford, right? There's probably people that go, I want Matthew Stafford. There's a lot of people that go, I have no interest in Kirk Cousins. And that's just an easy example. There's so many other examples, but it's like I was talking with Curtis on that Twitter thread. Outside of the elite receivers, it's basically just everybody else. There's some receivers that have like some glitz and glam. Everyone wants to buy them. Everybody wants to buy Elijah Moore right now. Everyone wants to go out and buy Jalen Waddle. Then there's other receivers, and you're like, the range of outcomes for those guys couldn't be that big of a difference, but nobody wants them at all. So that's where I think you can really, really use your leverage. If you're sitting on some of these players, understand the range of outcomes for a lot of them. And yeah, you may give up a year or two here. You may take a little more risk with a profile or a situation. But again, I'm speaking to a lot of people that play on a large scale here. So if you just look at this, the idea is basically it comes back to the CDLAM full circle. If a player's valued here when they're really in this big mix of players and they're on the very high end, at least by the market, of that huge mix of like 200 guys, sell. When they start to fall back into the middle of that mix, then you can buy. And a lot of times, I like to buy these types of players. And this is the big difference. I want to buy these types of players without giving up any leverage. So sure, I'll give up the 103 for CDLAM. That's fine. In another league, I'll sell CDLAM, but you know what I want? I want a lesser receiver and a 23 first. It doesn't have to be a top 15 receiver. You know, it can be like Brandon Ayuk and a 23 first or something like that. Like I would consider that type of deal. Because again, I'm just shifting the leverage into my favor there. And in another league, sure, I'll give a 1-for-1. If you're giving up a 1-for-1 for a guy like CeeDee Lamb or a guy that's on the very high end of that big mishmash group, you're not losing any leverage, right? Especially if you're looking at the market and you're going, you know what, this is a really wide receiver heavy market. I have my 102 or I'm on my 103. Am I even going to consider a receiver with that pick? And if the answer is yes, then why not just trade it for CeeDee Lamb? So in that case, it makes sense. And that's where you work leverage and dynasty. And if you think about it, if you just think about what I said over the last couple minutes, players don't matter. What really matters most is you look at a team and you go through and you go, okay, how many of these players right now am I holding where the market probably values them much higher than truly what their impact is? And you can measure impact in a lot of different ways. I know RotoViz has some tools that they come out with. They look at the win rates for the best ball teams. It's not the exact same as Dynasty, but I think it's kind of cool to look at and you go, okay, these are the prototypes of players that actually contributed to my roster being better. And a lot of times that doesn't always line up with how the market demands players in Dynasty. And most often than not, if the market believes that a player is just going to get better because they're really young and they had a really good profile, somebody like Elijah Moore, then I'm probably going to sell him. You know why? Because he's in a tier with a ton of other receivers. A ton of those other receivers are pretty easy to buy if you pay market price offer. There's a lot of other people that are willing to overpay, and you can probably sell a guy like Elijah Moore and actually get the leverage back. So in a nutshell, I know I've gone almost 24 minutes on this video, actually just under 23, but in a nutshell, this is my strategy in Dynasty. I'm so far removed in trying to measure like player versus player. To me, a lot of the Dynasty theory is lost when you're sitting here putting out content going, okay, let's break down CeeDee Lamb versus T. Higgins versus DJ Moore versus AJ Brown. Who cares? Who cares? They're all the same. If you have a super convicted bet that one of those four guys is so much better, and I have that one, guess what? I'll take the leverage from you because you're, in a way, arrogant, thinking you know how this is going to play out. We have enough of a sample size to probably say the range of outcomes for those guys is all really similar. So if you want to make a big bet, if you want to go out and go, I'm convicted, I'm putting my stamp down, I'm putting my foot down that that guy is AJ Brown. Okay, so you're going to give up CeeDee Lamb and a second. You know, there's not a huge difference there. So I'm almost always going to take the side with the leverage. That's how I play Dynasty. And a lot of people don't necessarily like it. They don't necessarily agree with it. And I will acknowledge for the person that's in 2 or 3 leagues, obviously you have to be a little more meticulous on the moves that you make. First and foremost, you only have a couple teams. You want to be happy with your teams. You want to look at your teams and go, you know what? I got guys that I like. I got guys that I truly in my heart believe in. And that's just not me. You know, I'm in, like I said, 60 plus leagues. So I really don't have conviction on players. I just have convictions on market values and where player trends are headed, and then I'll act accordingly. So yeah, I mean that's the flaw, and I guess in my game, and where maybe I disconnect with a lot of dynasty players. And sometimes when you get in a random Twitter thread, it's like I'll throw something out, and really it's coming from this philosophy and this mindset. But if someone reading it is only in 1 or 2 leagues, they're going to have a hard time really putting it into scope what I'm saying. Because again, I think this is the most effective way to play when you're playing on a larger scale. And you don't have to be in 60 leagues. You don't even have to be in 40 leagues. But if you're up to like a dozen or 15, you're to a point where you can start establishing some of these principles and go, you know what? I'm going to get the leverage on one side and I'm going to sell over here, try to get the leverage, and I'm going to buy over here without giving up any leverage. And it's that simple. And a lot of times, leverage in Dynasty just means kind of converting one asset into two strong assets where you think that there's a bet that you can make that one of those two assets that you get becomes close to the one that you traded away. So that's it in a nutshell. I know this was almost 30 minutes. That's not my intent, but there was just so much on my mind the last couple of days. And I've been in so many different threads, kind of debating this player versus that player. And a lot of times people are just arguing on two totally different planes. You have the people that are literally trying to figure out the difference between CeeDee Lamb and T. Higgins. And they're literally trying to go through and say, okay, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, this will happen, this won't happen. None of that stuff is really predictive to say for sure what the market is going to do. And then you have people like myself and many, many others that have come in and go, this argument is stupid. This is a waste of time. It's almost like we should be using this example of two really high profile players, right? I mean, CeeDee Lamb is one of the most high profile players in Dynasty. We should be using this as an example to kind of teach some Dynasty principles and some Dynasty theory and just get you thinking. You don't have to play in 40 leagues. You don't even have to play in 10. But if you're just thinking this way, it's going to make you a better Dynasty player. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video talking about the running backs a little bit more, because I think right now, with what we've seen the last 2 years, the running back landscape is fascinating, but it's also very tough to navigate if you're holding some of these players. And people will message me all the time and they'll say, what are you doing with like Rashad Penny, or what are you doing with like Sony Michel or Leonard Fournette or James Conner? And you really just have to weigh what your roster build looks like versus, what's the market value on those players? What can you actually get for them? And, we've all been in those shoes where it's like, okay, yeah, James Conner's on the block in February. Okay, what are you going to get for him? What's someone to give you? A third, maybe? And you're just underwhelmed by any possible offer. So immediately when you get that experience over multiple leagues with many of these players that are in that tier, you're going to go, okay, well, let me go buy, right? I'm going to go out there and try to buy these guys because clearly I can't sell them for squat. Then you go out and try to buy and you go, well, yeah, nobody's going to sell me, Leonard Fournette for a third. So you're stuck, right? You can't buy, you can't sell. So how do you actually value players like that? And I think at running back, it's super fascinating. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe I'll drop a running back video. Shout out to Clay with Dynasty Pandemic for allowing me to do this. You can find me on Twitter at CharlesChillFFB. And the podcast is back. Dynasty and Chill at Dynasty Chill Pod. So check that out if you're not a subscriber. And there's a link on the video. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts and many other places where podcasts are found. So find me at CharlesChillFFB, hashtag Dynasty Leverage, and love interacting with everybody. So appreciate, again, Clay with Dynasty Pandemic. Be chill, everybody.